So our next presenter is actually would have loved to be here in person, but we let him do the presentation online because he had a very good reason. His wife is expecting and her due date is now. And traveling here would have complicated things if she went in labor. So um, his name is Tyler Nigon. He's was a principal scientist at Sentra. He just stepped down from that position. He has expertise in precision ag and remote sensing applications to improve nitrogen management. And Tyler holds a PhD degree from the University of Minnesota. So we will listen to the presentation online, and then we will proceed in the same way with Q&A after the presentation. So again, type those questions as you have them.
Hello everyone, my name is Tyler Nigon. First I would like to thank Fabian for the kind invitation to speak at today's nitrogen conference. Apologies for not being in person. My wife and I are actually expecting our first child, and so on. That means unfortunately could not make the trip today, but we're very excited about that. Today I will be talking about conducting your own on-farm studies. As far as an agenda, I'll start out with an introduction, get into why you might want to conduct your own on-farm studies, and then the meat of the presentation today will be the elements of a good on-farm trial. Things about developing measurable research questions, having a good experimental design, and then executing on that design and performing the analysis. I'll finish up then with a recap. A little bit of a background about myself. I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. This is a nice aerial photo of the farm. My parents still own and operate the farm, and I'm very much inspired and motivated, and much of what I do comes from the farm. I attended the University of Minnesota for my graduate work. I first did a master's degree where my research was in potato nitrogen. And then for my PhD research, I worked in corn nitrogen. Now, both of these focused on precision agriculture, or they had an element of precision agriculture to them. And they also both had an element of on-farm research. So first, why conduct your own on-farm studies? In one word, it comes down to variability. We're trying to grasp or get a handle or get an understanding on the variability that exists on our farm and how different management practices and things might influence, how variability might influence these different practices. So the variability that we'll see is in the form of spatial variability, things like soil topography, things like your management practices or your equipment. Every farm will have slightly different management practices, of course, different sets of equipment at their disposal. And then probably most noteworthy, temporal variability. This includes the seasonal weather, and the weather that your farm experiences one season to the next is virtually never the same, has an influence on things like nitrogen availability and things like that. So we know that every farm and really every field is different, and on-farm studies allow growers to understand how management practices, crop inputs, equipment will perform in their specific cropping system. Some examples of different management include crop rotation, use of cover crops, your specific fertility program, pest management. Different crop inputs that you might use on your farm include seed treatments, different fertilizer sources, whether you use inhibitors and in what situation, and pesticide use. And then of course, tillage, conventional till versus no-till. The row spacing of your equipment, are you using 30-inch rows or maybe you're using 20-inch rows? Fertilizer application methods that usually depend on the equipment that you have at your disposal, and then of course irrigation. So now onto the elements of putting in an effective on-farm trial. If it's not set up correctly, just keep in mind that you risk spending your time and money without really learning much about what you're trying to learn. So first, we want to make sure that we Choose a research objective or a research question that you can measure. Second, spend some time planning. Plan out your experimental design and kind of know how to do that, or know the fundamentals of that. And then finally, execute the trial properly. So I'll go through each of these in the rest of my presentation, and I'll dig into each one of them. So first, choosing an objective that you can measure. When choosing an objective, really ask yourself, what are you trying to learn? Is it something that has to do with seeding population or timing? We might be looking at a standard seeding rate versus a rate that's slightly lower or slightly higher. Or are we looking at early planting versus planting 2 weeks later? With crop hybrids or varieties, maybe we're looking at variety A versus variety B and how do they perform. Nutrients and fertility. If it's a rate experiment, maybe we're curious to know, how does our standard rate compare to backing off on our fertilizer 10% or something like that. Nutrient source, maybe looking at slow release fertilizer versus our conventional source. And timing, looking at application at planting or whatever the standard practice might be versus an in-season application. New products. This might be looking at our standard practice, or maybe doing nothing versus looking at a biological or a biostimulant that is available on the market. Cover crops versus no cover crops, and with tillage, maybe the conventional tillage versus strip till. Now some tips on how to formulate a good objective. Good objectives are simple and straightforward. Remember, don't overcomplicate things. Less is more here. And I recommend only look at one, and if you really, really have to, maybe 2 different variables. But really, on-farm research should only look at 1 variable. And as far as the number of treatment factors, try to keep this to a minimum. 2 is certainly the simplest, where we're just comparing a control to a treatment. And sometimes we might want to add a positive control in, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is a little bit later. Second, good objectives are relevant. Be sure that your measurements can answer the question that you're really interested in. And it's important not to go beyond the scope of what you can actually measure. And so we don't want to get too complicated or make things too complex. And an example of this might be a proposed research question that wants to look at, where you want to look at nitrogen use efficiency. Now, aside from the many ways that nitrogen use efficiency can be calculated, it's a measurement that oftentimes requires many different observations to be able to contextualize the result and really understand it. And so that's an example of where maybe nitrogen use efficiency, although it can be really helpful and important to learn about, it might not be the best thing to look at in an on-farm trial, at least if you're not experienced. But the key here is just to remember to ensure that the question that you're asking is relevant to your operation, and that you can answer it with the measurements. And that leads us to the third thing. Good objectives are measurable. Know what you're going to measure and how. Are you going to use sensors? Are you going to use physical sampling, etc.? Now, in my experience, 9 out of 10, or maybe even more, on-farm studies will focus on grain yield and the resulting economics. But there are some that might want to look at validating plant nutrient uptake, nutrient retention, soil test level. In any of these cases, whether grain yield or not, just know that know how you're going to measure these, and just as importantly, when you will measure them. So as I mentioned, most on-farm studies are going to look at grain yield. So I'm going to dig into that a little bit and just kind of go through different ways that grain yield can be measured. If you have a yield monitor on your combine, this is a great way. It's very efficient and can be a really effective way to get a measure of the yield. Just remember that the best practice is to calibrate often. should have a plan for offloading the data. Do you know how to get the data off of the monitor, and being able to load onto your computer or a yield cleaning and processing software. Once you do that, do you know how the steps to do proper yield cleaning and processing, or do you have a resource, an agronomist or somebody that can help you out with that? And then finally, summarizing these spatial data files. When we get data off of a yield monitor, there's oftentimes dozens, if not hundreds, sometimes thousands of points within each plot. And all of those samples are great in terms of the spatial precision we get and knowing the yield in any given part of the field. But remember, when it comes time to analyze the results, that we need to summarize these into our the specific plots or the experimental units from our trial. The second way to measure grain yield would be with a weigh wagon or a grain cart with a scale. Some tips here, probably most importantly, check to make sure that it's emptied out after each measurement. This goes for the combine hopper as well as the weigh wagon. If there's any grain left in there, it can introduce sampling error into your results, which will make it tough to interpret the results. Second, try to record weight on a level surface, and ideally you just want to put your weigh wagon in one location in the field and just kind of leave it parked there. Drive your combine to that spot if you can get away with it, just to kind of remove that variable at all in terms of the angle or the position of that weigh wagon having an influence on the weight. And then something to keep in mind, ask yourself, will you be able to fit the whole plot in one load? Sometimes with wide combine headers, with long strips, we'll fill up or we'll have a hopper that has more grain in it that can fit in the weigh wagon. So just have, that's more of a logistical concern, and just kind of know what are you getting into, how much time will it take you to harvest that plot. And then finally, regarding grain yield, I certainly recommend considering grain moisture and test weight. Ask yourself if you expect the treatment to influence moisture or test weight. If you do, you certainly want to measure these things on every single time you fill the weigh wagon. But even if you don't, I recommend measuring them and standardizing for them or accounting for them, because both can have a substantial influence on the economic return. And if you don't have a moisture density sensor, you can ask an agronomist, your service providers, or even your neighbors if you can borrow theirs. They'll probably be really interested in the results of your study and would probably love to collaborate with you. Okay, now after we've chosen an objective, a research objective or research question that we can measure, the next thing is to plan out our experimental design. Some examples of common trial designs that are often used on farm. This is an example of a paired comparison. This is where we'd have one variable and two treatment factors, A and B, and we just put them in several locations as strips across the field, and we do that paired comparison. A slightly more complex version of this would be what I refer to as a strip trial, and that's similar to a paired comparison strip where there's strips and such, only here we have more than two treatment factors. In this case, there's 5 treatment factors. So it requires a lot larger field area, at least if the plot size is the same, because we have more treatments, meaning more plots. The most complex, and you probably wouldn't use this unless you really have a rather sophisticated research question, a Latin square or a randomized complete block design. It can absolutely be used for on-farm research, but it might have different requirements for precision equipment or GPS-enabled auto application. And And the next thing I just kind of wanted to point out, I sometimes might refer to a plot or a strip, but both of these are just an experimental unit, and it just refers to the field area that's receiving a single treatment within a replication. So it's kind of that lowest unit of our experiment. So when it comes time to planning out our experimental design, we want to have a control. I've mentioned control a few times already. We want to do blocking, and we want to do randomization and replication. So I'll go into each of these in some detail here, just to kind of provide an overview of what they are and why we do them. So the control is a treatment factor that is used as the benchmark to compare against other treatments. It's typically the treatment factor that doesn't receive a treatment, or it can sometimes be what the standard practice is. So, and one example is, if we're doing a potassium study and our treatment is 80 pounds of K2O, the control might be a 0 or a low K2O rate. If this is a negative control, it's the treatment factor that does not receive the treatment. The important thing here is to just be sure that the control treatment is managed the same as the rest of the treatments, except for the treatment itself. So some different examples on what we might use as a control in some different experimental questions. If we're looking at seeding population, the control might be the standard practice seeding rate that we use. If you're looking at crop hybrids or varieties, it might be a seed product that you're familiar with. Maybe you've used this hybrid variety on your farm for several years. You're comfortable with it. You know that it's consistent, and it's something that you can use as a benchmark to compare against other varieties that might be newer. With nutrient rate, maybe this is a standard practice and you're looking to reduce or maybe increase your nutrient rate a little bit. It could also be a 0 rate if you're looking for the response of that nutrient on your soil. With new products, the control would be without the product, and with cover crops, without the cover crop. Okay, next I'm going to walk through an example where slightly interactive, where you can kind of think to yourself and try to select the control given our situation. So let's imagine there's a biostimulant that's on the market, and it claims that it can provide an extra 20 pounds of nitrogen in corn. So this is great. You're excited for this, so you want to test this on your own farm and see if that claim kind of extends to your specific local conditions. So on your farm, before planting, your field will receive 120 pounds of nitrogen as urea. And then at planting, the biostimulant treatment is to be applied with starter fertilizer. This is according to the label recommendation. And the starter that you're applying will provide 15 pounds of additional nitrogen. So what should the control treatment be? Should it be that equal to that blanket application of 120 pounds of nitrogen as urea before planting? Should it be that 120 pounds of urea plus 15 pounds of nitrogen that is in your starter that was applied with the biostimulant? Or should it be that 120 pound blanket application plus 35 pounds of nitrogen as starter? And that is calculated or kind of determined as an option as the 15 pounds of nitrogen in the starter plus the extra 20 pounds that the product claim says will provide. So totaling 155 total pounds. So if you thought that the control should be this 120 pounds plus 15 pounds of starter, you are correct. The important thing here is, or the main point here is a word of caution to be careful when putting in your control with crop inputs, especially whose recommended application method might confound your research question. So in this case, the recommended application method was to put the the product on with starter, it's just important to make sure that that starter gets applied in your control as well. Otherwise, it's not an apples to apples comparison. This might sound simple, but it's actually a mistake that I see way too often where the control is underrepresented or misrepresented, and it makes it difficult, impossible really to interpret the results. Now I want to introduce an example now of a positive control treatment. Now sometimes you'll want to add a comparative product or practice that you might expect to behave similarly to the treatments of interest. Now a positive control is definitely not necessary in all experiments. It depends on the research question that you're asking. But going back to this last example again, instead of asking what should the control treatment be, if we ask what should the positive control treatment be, and you might have already guessed it would be this last one where we're putting 120 pounds of urea plus that 35 pounds of nitrogen as starter in. Now this is it's really another treatment. It can be thought of as a positive control, but it's really what we want to benchmark the biostimulant against. In this case, the grower might be thinking, hey, I can invest in 120 pounds. Sorry, I can invest in the biostimulant that I put on with my starter, or I can put that money towards just increasing my starter rate, or maybe there's another enhanced efficiency product that I'm using that could be used as a positive control. But the point is, it's some direct comparison of how I could invest my resources to make a comparison that I would expect should behave similarly. So in this case, in this example, both the negative and the positive controls can be helpful to evaluate the product. And again, it just depends on what your research question is and what you're really trying to get at. The main point here is that the urea alone is not a sufficient control. Okay, on to blocking. Blocking can be helpful to account for field variability. When you're blocking, you want to always try to account for differences in inherent soil properties, topography, management, and management zones, maybe things related to known fertility differences in the field. Blocking really forces all treatment factors to be present in areas of the field that have similar underlying soil properties. Every block will include every treatment factor, and it allows us to account for the spatial variability. For example, soil moisture. In this figure, we're looking at 3 blocks, 9 plots altogether, and in each block, each treatment, 2, 1, and 3, are represented. They're represented in different orders, and that's because of the randomization, which we're going to do next. But block 2, treatment 2, 3, and 1. Block 3, treatment 3, 2, and 1. As opposed to putting all treatment 1s on, say, the north end of the field and all treatment 3s on the south end of the field, where the inherent soil properties might confound our results if we know that there's differences in the soil. So this is blocking. It can be really helpful then to try to account for some of that spatial variability and standardize for it. Lastly, replication and randomization. These are really required. I would absolutely not recommend not doing them. Replication is needed for your study to have any sort of statistical power, which, said in another way, it just means that we can't have confidence that the treatment that we're applying was in fact responsible for the differences that we measured if we don't have replication. The statistical power just gives us the confidence to know the probability that differences were actually true. Randomization, on the other hand, prevents biases, for example, due to soil variability. The example of let's make sure that all of our similar treatments are spread out through the field. Okay, the importance of replication and randomization as an overview. Replication provides statistical power. Randomization helps to prevent bias for specific parts of the field. You might ask the question, why not split a field in half? It may seem like an easy way or a useful approach to test a particular product or practice, but there's a lot of reasons not to do it. First, did you account for the underlying variability in the field? So in this case, the elevation is much lower in the west half than the east half. And we know that topography and the soils with different topographies are different, and they will behave different agronomically. Just the spatial variability alone in fields makes splitting a field a very poor approach. Examples, like I've mentioned already, include soil texture and type, soil moisture, elevation, topography, underlying soil fertility, organic matter, and weed or pest pressure. This is something that I see a lot. It's called on-farm research, but it's something that we should absolutely watch out for and try to avoid splitting a field in half. So an alternative to this would be to leverage multiple experimental units. Take that field area and just try to apply our treatment in multiple plots instead of just 2 plots where we don't have any randomization, splitting the field in half, using 8 or 10 plots depending on our treatments, and replicate, randomize, and this will help us capture and control for the spatial variability as we go from one end or one side of the field to the other. As I mentioned, I see this split a field in half approach quite often. I kind of think of them, I term them as demonstration plots or demonstration trials. Very different than on-farm research. Whereas on-farm research using replication, randomization, blocking leverages these experimental design principles and statistics to ensure that we have confidence in the differences that we see and that those differences are in fact due to the treatments. Demonstration plots, they might be nice to see, visual appearance or difference, but just know that there's no measure of reliability between the treatments. It's just a demonstration. And so the message here is that a demonstration is not a substitute for an on-farm study. Be careful with marketing claims. I've seen a lot of marketing claims that they claim to validate their claims using research trials, but just make sure that what they're citing use appropriate experimental design. In my experience, a lot of times these can tend to be demonstration plots and not actually replicated studies. Okay, now that we've planned out the experimental design, now we know what we're going to do. The final step is to execute the trial and to do it properly. And so for this, I'm going to go through a few different tips that will just help us to execute these field trials. The first one, matching equipment with. So the first example in an optimal situation, when we're looking at our planter versus our applicator versus our harvester, think about the width of the combine head versus the width of the planter versus the spreader. Now this depends on your research question. What is your treatment? Are you putting in a seeding rate where the treatment is applied with your planter, or are you putting in a treatment that is a nutrient application that is put on with a spreader different than your planter maybe? So depending on your research questions, not all of these will be relevant. The combine is usually always relevant because if we're measuring yield, that's the sort of the width or the resolution that we can measure at. So in an optimal situation, all of your equipment is a multiple of each other. And in the case where we have a 20-foot or an 8-row combine header, a 40-foot planter or a 16-row planter, and a spreader at 80 feet, this is a nice easy one because they're multiples of 20, and it just makes sense. We would make our strip or our plots 20 feet wide at the narrowest. We could always go to 40 feet or larger if we wanted to, but just kind of keep in mind the spatial variability, and we kind of want to keep our plots small if we can. Now, a more challenging situation might be where we have a 10-row combine header, sorry, a 12-row combine header, 30 feet, a planter that's 16 rows, and then a sprayer that's 90 feet. Now, these aren't multiples of each other, and so we might find ourselves, if the treatments were applied with the planter, we might find ourselves having to combine and harvest our plot or part of our treatment with a whole pass at the combine, and then take off a strip before combining the next plot. And so that's sort of illustrated here, where there's gaps in our combine width in terms of what we're including in our from the data, what we're including as far as the data for our results. Okay, tip number 2, make a plot map before you put your trial in. I think more than anything, plot maps help to make communication with different stakeholders easier, whether you're getting help applying your treatments, or you're having somebody come and do some scouting or something like that for you. And it's also a really good resource for you to double check your design and your plan. Plot maps really, I think, just set you up for success. It can be a simple thing. Absolutely recommend doing this before you put your experiment in, and then going back and just tweaking it after you've put it in, tweaking it if necessary in terms of if things changed from your plan versus what you actually did. Tip number 3, put flags or stakes in the ground when the treatments themselves are applied. I also recommend labeling them with your plot ID and ideally your treatment information as well. That can make for a nice interactive growing season anytime you visit the field location and kind of do a walkthrough, having direct access to what plot you're looking at, what the treatment was, without having to reference a plot map, can be a nice way to visually kind of see what's going on. When putting these flags and stakes in, I also recommend getting a GPS location to approximately mark the corners of the plots. This is something that, when it comes time to offload yield data from your combine monitor and analyze those results, you'll thank yourself later for that, or whoever's doing that analysis and processing. Tip number 4, partner with University Extension, especially with the help with the statistical analysis. Also to provide feedback on experimental design and any questions that you might have as you navigate through how to set up your experiment. A quick tidbit on statistical significance. It's something that you may hear quite often. I just kind of want to go over some basics of it. Statistical significance really indicates whether the measurement is due to treatment factors or due to random chance. And statistical significance is used or can be measured or calculated when we do things like randomize replicate and use different treatments. So common statistical tests that quantify the probability of a significant difference include t-tests. These would be for paired comparisons where we only have 2 treatments, or contrast. An analysis of variance when we have more treatments. And then least significant differences when this is where we're computing the difference between one treatment mean and the difference. What is that difference that actually makes the treatments statistically different from each other? And then the last tip, strive for quality. I'd say serve as the quality control advocate for your own trial. Definitely take notes throughout the season. And just remember, if it's not set up correctly, you risk spending your time and money without really learning a whole lot. It's really important to manage your own expectations, whether planned or unplanned. If things happen throughout the season that result in cutting corners in either the planning, the design, or the execution of the study, it's important to just understand the consequences. What does that mean in terms of what you're going to learn or what you're capable of learning at the end of the season? Most times the decisions that we make during the season might be a little bit different if we really understand the ramifications that we, at the end of the season. And if we just kind of know about them beforehand while we're making those decisions, it just helps us to make better decisions. No one will care more about the quality of the experiment than you, most likely. So just be your own advocate. Okay, with that, I'll just sort of wrap up and recap kind of what we went over today. First, on-farm studies are a great way to learn and improve your production. When it comes time to choosing your research question, do so carefully, deliberately, make sure it's relevant to your operation. Always use good experimental design, including replication, randomization, blocking. Consult an expert if you have to, especially when you're getting started. And absolutely don't overlook the control treatments. Sometimes it seems really simple, and sometimes it usually is, I guess, but it's a mistake that is oftentimes made. So just absolutely double check and triple check that the control treatments are in and that you're applying them correctly. Just a reminder, demonstrations and demonstration plots are not equal to on-farm research, especially in regards to the statistical significance and our confidence in the probability that what is being reported is actually true. When installing field trials, always use good practices, use plot maps, put in flags or stakes, take notes throughout the season. Again, you can consult extension or service providers for help with the statistical analysis. And remember, no one will care more about the quality of this experiment than you. It's your own farm, and you're the most important stakeholder here. So be the quality control advocate in your studies. And as a final wrap up, every farm has variability, and whether it's the cropping system, the rotation, soils, etc., this variability really contributes or affects your farm uniquely. No farm is going to be alike, and the reason that we want to conduct your own on-farm studies is to sort of understand that variability better, and more importantly, understand how the different things that we are in control of, the management interventions that we could make, might help us control that variability better or adapt to it. There's a lot here in this presentation. I kind of went through everything pretty fast. And like with anything else, I'd say the best way to learn is through experience and try things for yourself. Definitely start simple. I'd say get started now. They say the best time to plant a tree was yesterday. I think on-farm research or on-farm studies are very similar to that. The the best time to get started was last year, because every time you have an opportunity, every time you put one in, you have an opportunity to learn something new, and we only have so many growing seasons. And on that same note, I think there's a lot of on-farm data. There's a lot of data generated from a farm out there, and having records all the way from our management to having the dates of planting to the dates of application, what we've done, they're all really, really important when we're wanting to imagine yourself 10 years from now and you want to kind of look back on how your farm behaves, and imagine tools that are using things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, things like that. Having all of that data accessible and ready will help you to feed into those tools a lot easier. And so by getting started now in terms of organizing that data, even if the tools aren't all the way there in terms of their development, I do believe they will have a lot of value for individual growers, but only if we're able to leverage and get historical data across many different seasons. So with that, thank you again for the opportunity to speak at this conference, and I'm sure there's plenty of folks around that are capable of answering questions on this topic today, but if you'd like, feel free to contact me. My email address is here, otherwise you can find me on LinkedIn, and feel free to reach out with any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. One question. This approach sounds great with so many new products available. How do we launch programs in Minnesota to help farmers make it happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are different groups that kind of have communities for on-farm experimentation. One that comes to mind is the International Precision Ag Group. So that's something that's not like broader than just Minnesota, but kind of could serve as a model for how to get a similar group in a more localized, like in Minnesota itself. I think University of Nebraska, the state of Nebraska, has a community as well. But yeah, I think that certainly would be a really good thing to do in Minnesota, is to sort of have a support group to ask questions, answer questions, share experiences, share results, things like that.
All right. Well, thank you again. Let's give Tyler a hand.